All right, thank you all for joining me. This is community-driven development, playtesting in public. If you're in the wrong room, if you need to be in chemistry class, this is your cue to exit. My name is Cole Worley. I am the creative director and lead designer at Very Giant Studios, and I am delighted to be giving this talk with all of you. This talk started as a bit of a rumination on how we make games. One of the funny things about working in the industry professionally is that if you can make it past that little ledge and do it professionally, you assume you figured out some secret, some essential character to how games are supposed to be made. And then when you find yourself at your first party, surrounded by other people who have figured out how to do it professionally, you realize that everyone is doing it incredibly differently. And there is in fact no key, there's no single way of doing it. And what I found specifically is that the style of games that I like to make and the manner in which I make them was completely alien to the vast number of publishers and other designers that I know working professionally. So I worked on a bunch of games over the past decade or so. Some of them are listed here. I try to do all the main titles here. I'm probably best known for Root and most recently Arcs and Molly House. All of these games, which are different in terms of genre, production, audience, they were all built basically using the same core principles. And I can extend that even broader, more broadly to expansions I've worked on, other titles I've helped with development. They actually all borrow the same basic strategy. Now, about a year ago, or a little over a year ago, myself and my editor, Josh Yearsley, decided that we wanted to start talking about this way of making games. And we thought, well, let's find the biggest stage we can find, which is, of course, at GDC. But GDC is a digital games convention, so we had to kind of pretend like we were making digital games. So we filled our talk proposal with buzzwords, like early access and beta and all that kind of stuff, A/B testing, things like that, to trick them into supporting our talk and to bringing us out. And it worked beautifully. And we presented this talk, Early Access Tabletop, about a year ago. And when my brother asked me to give a talk on playtesting, my first thought was, sucker, I already wrote this talk. This is easy. And I sat down planning on just revising a couple paragraphs, sorting a few things out. And what I realized was that actually this was a very different kind of talk, because we had stripped away a lot of the things that make tabletop games special when presenting it to a digital audience. And we had also neglected to talk about the fundamental ways that tabletop design is different. So what I want to offer you all today is the uncut version of this talk, and the talk that is primarily directed towards the folks that are working in tabletop games. And here is the fundamental difference. Digital games were born in people's garages and closets. That is work done in cloistered communities, copied on floppy drives, mailed out to people. It is separated from the community in its origins. Now, of course, now that's different. So they are learning to operate with community now, but that isn't where digital games came from. But tabletop games did come from the community. So I always like to start any talk on tabletop games by talking about how old they are. Tabletop games are basically the oldest crafted objects that we have. They're about as old as textiles. And in fact, these two games that I'm showing here, the Royal Game of Ur and Modern Chess, I put dates next to them mostly as a joke, because chess, of course, is a lot older than 1400, but it comes into its modern form in the early modern period. The Royal Game of Ur has antecedents that go back past Senate to the very earliest days of prehistory. And if you look at these ancient games, you can find a few commonalities. They have a few number of piece classes. They have simple boards. And by simple, I mean you could draw it in the sand. You could fashion a set of chess pieces. I had a factory job one summer at this steel factory in Wisconsin, and we got bored in the evenings. And we would make little chess sets just out of bolts and screws that we could play with, because I was working with these folks on prison release. You couldn't bring anything into the workplace. But it was pretty easy to build a set of chess. And if you didn't know how to play chess, someone could probably teach you from memory. And this has far-ranging impacts to how the games are actually developed. So this little map illustrates the history and development of chess over about 1,000 years. It has its origins in northern India, kind of Rajasthan, Punjab, and then it spreads, and it has a kind of eastern branch and a western branch. And this spread happens over, one, a tremendously long period of time, we're talking about 1,000 years, and two, using a wide variety of people. While chess was played in the palace, it wasn't the only place it was played. And so the game intersects with court communities, palace communities, caravans, slave communities, basically anywhere where there are people playing games. So you might have learned chess as a kid, you might have been captured and put in captivity, you might teach it to the children that you are watching in your old age, they might teach it to their grandchildren, and rules are being lost, and best practices are starting to emerge. But this is a community-driven process. Now, there's a big problem for this method when it comes to the modern marketplace, which is you can't sell this. And you can't sell a game that takes 1,000 years to make. Fortunately, the market always finds a way. And so here we have some mass production of some early board games. Over here on the far left, we have Crossroads to the Conqueror's Castle, or The Journey. This is a very beautifully produced lithograph from the 19th century. It is colorful, and it is beautiful, and it is what you'd call an art-first graphic design. And what the publisher is selling when they are selling that board game is the production of the board game. You're buying that Ian O'Toole art, and it looks great. You could probably draw this map, but the map itself is like a little hard to remember. It's not using those easy systems like an 8x8 grid that would allow you to imprint it and to communicate it. But that's fine, because you're not supposed to remember it. You need the object to play the game. And publishers, following this trend, found ways of patenting all kinds of things, including games that they didn't originally design, like Monopoly. And you'll see that in the display of Monopoly here, we also have the pieces themselves, which are proprietary and strange. Now, many of you probably know those Monopoly pieces right here. These were like overstocked game pieces that the company happened to have access to. So they didn't decide like, everyone's going to be a boot. It's brilliant. This will be the best-selling game of the 20th century. They just happen to have a lot of like little pieces around. And this continues through the 20th century. Stratego has those specialized two-sided pieces. If you bought the early editions of Stratego, they would use wooden pieces with kind of foil stamped on one side. Operation, of course, is a little circuit. Nobody wants to go out and buy a little red light bulb for their homemade Operation set. You can buy one at your local Walmart. Now, who's actually making these games? Well, over here on the far left, we have Sid Sackson with a big stack of games. The critical thing about Sid Sackson, he's probably the most prolific game designer of the 20th century. And his name was basically on none of the games that he published in his lifetime, with some exceptions. There's work being done. There's a class of people who are building these games, but they are doing it in generally isolated forms, using very hyper-local communities, and they're largely invisible. Now, this caused some rancor when we get to the rise of commercial games in Europe. And so in 1988, the Coaster Agreement at the Nuremberg Toy Fair, all these German designers got together at a pub. They were getting mad. They were yelling at publishers. This is what designers do in their pubs. And they signed an agreement that said, no one here is going to sign a game unless the publisher lets us put the name on the box. And they thought they were being very contrarian and very brave. But actually, this was a great deal for publishers, because suddenly we had the idea of an author brand. And here's Rainier Knizia, looking not quite like a brand. We're pre-bow tie still. But this is great because you put that little name there and it's like Stephen King's name. Suddenly the name itself becomes another object that can be sold. And it's not so long before you get increasingly cultivated, curated marketing campaigns, the kinds of things that you see in video games. Big E3s, big events, lots of lights and lasers. And that's fine. That's as someone who also traffics in my own brand and community around these games, it's good to be able to sell an experience. But it's also doing some other work. It's creating a division between the people who are viewing the game and the people who are making the game. And that has deep, deep consequences for a form that started as a fundamentally communally driven folk art. So it doesn't have to be like this. What I want to do over the course of this talk is go through my own design history and talk about how I stumbled into the way I make games and derive some lessons from each project. Because the key thing that I want to communicate, especially at this early stage, is I did not know that this was going to be how we were going to design games. We stumbled into it. We made a lot of mistakes, and hopefully I can spare some of you some of those mistakes. So I began my work in games by playing games that look like this. This is Kriegbot by Matt Eklund. I bought this game in a Ziploc bag at a little game store in Austin, Texas. And the pieces look like that. They look like that. If you recognize that little rubber ant, you might say, I feel like that was in a plastic tube at a dollar store. Well, that's exactly where it was from. And you can imagine that the people assembling these copies were going to their local Dollar General and buying about 10 of those tubes and seeing if they could get 30 or 40 copies of Kriegbot out of that purchase. These were scrappy games. They were charming. And I was, as a young graduate student, trying to learn graphic design. And I was doing it by looking at games like this and saying, I think I could make it like 20% prettier. Like, I'm not very good at graphic design, but I think I might be just a little bit better. And what I found was that I would do a redraw of a game. I would send it to the designer who had posted their AOL email. I don't even know. Yeah, it is right there. Matthew.Eklund at Ymail? I don't know. It might still work. I sent them an email and then suddenly found myself in these private Yahoo groups. They actually weren't private. You just had to ask to join. And then pretty soon, they were sending me links to Google Docs with thousands of comments. Sadly, the comments are all closed. I had no way to capture the chaos of opening a rules document and seeing mostly well-natured, even-tempered discussion that was thousands and thousands of words from all sorts of folks. And the most remarkable thing about this is the designer, as a voice, was present everywhere, but was not dictatorial. If you looked in the comment threads, this is from the Google Doc for PAX Renaissance, which was designed by Phil and Matt. Matt and Phil's voice are in the comments. They're arguing with people. They're having a conversation, but they're not working by fiat. It's actually a very open process. And it was interesting. And in one of those threads, a thread, I believe it was part of one of the versions of PAX Ren, was the insistence that hey, maybe I should work on my own PAX game. Would I mind designing it? And then I'm starting to have a conversation about another game in a discussion thread for a different game that is under development. And that basically is the story of the first block of games that I worked on. These were all games that emerged very organically out of a community of people who were interested in designing the sorts of games that they wanted to see in the world. This is a really key element. The testing community and the community of players are the same community, and they are interested in what might be possible with these games. Now, Infamous Traffic has a little bit of a different origin just because it was built in a more closed fashion. But basically, Pamir and John Company were built in this incredibly public, incredibly early way. This was a chaotic way to work, but you learned some key lessons very quickly. As with any bulleted list you're going to see over the next 20 minutes, they're going to seem obvious. That's the point. I want you to remember them. So the first thing is it almost seems like a direct contradiction. So we're working in a very democratic and even anarchic format. Everyone's got a voice. We're all talking. However, the person leading the project needs to have a strong voice and vision. They need to know what they want. They need to do the work of corralling, crafting, elevating the right voices, pushing down the voices that maybe are a little louder than they need to be. Being a designer fundamentally means making decisions. That's the thing you're doing. You're making decisions. Now, sometimes it's very easy to misinterpret that and to say, oh, so I get to overrule people. I'm the one, I get to be the decider, as our former president would call himself. No, you're not that much more important than anyone else in the room. It's just your job at that moment is to make the call. And so you want to treat the playtesters, your editors, your graphic designers with immense respect. They have tons of specialist knowledge you don't have, but your job is to make a call. So that's what you do. Secondly, you have to be extremely transparent. You have to go into this process knowing what you want and being able to recognize the places where your game isn't working. You have to be a communicator. You need to explain yourself. And you can't be defensive. The moment you act in a way that seems arbitrary to your audience, and by audience I mean also your community of playtesters, the moment they're going to start feeling like you're operating in bad faith. If you go into a playtest looking for people to tell you that you did a good job, the first people who are going to notice are the testers. And they're going to realize that they're not being brought in because of their expertise and because of their care for the game. They're being brought in to rubber stamp to make you feel better. It erodes trust. It breaks down the whole process. You cannot be defensive. Okay, so the history games came out. They all sold out right away. They did great. Now, part of this was like a little trick because we didn't print very many. So I knew when I was going into these history games that I was in a development community of perhaps 50, 100 people, that represented a very high percentage of the 1,000, 2,000, 3,000 people in my total audience. And if the game was still being played and still being enjoyed by this core 100,000, they were also doubling as a focus group, so I knew the game would do really well. Now, I didn't know if the game was going to sell 10,000 copies, but I knew we'd be able to get through our first print run. After I'd done those history games, I started working on Root. I moved up to Minnesota. I joined a full-time staff, and I got plugged into this project in its very early days. And I wanted to bring some of the early lessons that I had learned from that more communitarian way of building games. But there were problems. Right away, we knew that the audience was way bigger. Vast had sold 20,000 copies by the time that I started at Leader Games. That's more copies than probably all the games that I ever touched, even had incidental engagement with at Sierra Madre. So I knew the audience was going to be bigger. And so I looked at those lessons and thought, okay, well, I don't know how to bring in a community to the development process, but maybe we can be transparent, and transparency should be a big priority. So this took the form of design diaries. I noticed this morning, by the way, that I must have taken this screenshot like 6 years ago because of how old it posts the design diaries. We were very public about what we wanted Root to do, how we wanted it to work. We used that as an opportunity for the community to recognize themselves in the work that we were doing. So you would see very commonly in the threads, people recognizing each other as a fellow potential fan of what this thing could be. We were seeing like the early days of a community self-organizing. We also wanted people to engage. Now, you can comment on a BGG thread. That's a kind of engagement, but we're making games. I want people to play. So we also released print and plays throughout the process. Releasing print and plays is something that I could do like a whole 3-hour seminar on, because there are lots of little things that you can do in the design of a print and play that can make your game easier to assemble for potential players. But really, you will get there yourselves if you just follow the basic rule of, after you make the PDF, make yourself build it and see how long it takes. Because you will find yourself very mad at the version of you from an hour ago that wanted to put the cards in that way. Or like the worst thing is combining different size cards on different sheets of paper, on the same sheet of paper, so that if someone's using a paper cutter, they're going to destroy their own kit as they're building the kit. With Root, we kept it very simple, and Root had the virtue of being incredibly easy to prototype, especially prototype updates. A Root player board is an 8.5 by 11 sheet of paper. If you are downloading a new faction, you are printing one sheet of paper, maybe another sheet of paper for supplementary cards, maybe another sheet of paper for tokens. That's 3 pieces of paper. If you have an office job, no one is going to notice. You just you slide that in, you call it Q1 report, in and out. This worked really well. I was very proud of how much engagement we got from these. That the campaign far exceeded our goals, and because of that money, we were able to buckle down and work on the design of the game, and the game did super well. Won lots of awards, continues to sell exceptionally well, and part of that has to do with, of course, the product design, the art, and the design itself. But part of it also has to do with the activation of the community. When Root came out, there were players already willing to play it. There were people who already knew how to play it. So all that was built in at day one, at launch. And we had indications of this everywhere, such as when Kyle and I were ambushed at PAX 2019 by essentially like a Root flash mob. This is like the first of like many surprises when someone will come up to me with like an outrageous like Root spectacle that they've done. Like, I don't know, a bunch of elevators that say ROOT that you may see here at Gamma. However, this was a deeply flawed approach that we didn't realize was flawed. This is another like little thing that I wish I could just put in a little box and give everyone who attends a professional seminar. One of the hardest things about working in any kind of creative endeavor is you're going to fail a lot, but your successes are going to blind you to the places where you made a mistake. They cause the data to be faulty. So we actually made tons of mistakes on Root, but we didn't even realize we had made mistakes until years later. For instance, my priority with Root was transparency. All of the work that I was doing and trying to get people to engage with the game wasn't because I had some highfalutin idea about a community-driven development. It was because I wanted people to know what we were doing. So my priority was transparency. That meant that the folks on BGG, the people downloading the kits, they weren't collaborators, they were fans, which is a little dismissive. And it's especially dismissive given how much I would later learn they can contribute to the process. But because we were done so well, I didn't even notice these things. And so when we went off to work on Oath, we kind of planned to do the exact same play. We didn't even do a debrief about Root. It was, what do we have to say? Good job, everyone. We did such a lovely time. Let's go do it again. And all I knew about Oath was that it was going to be larger. So I took the exact same approach and I just scale tooled it up. I said, okay, twice as many design diaries, twice as many kits. But I don't need a bunch of public testers. I don't want to be in a Google Doc with a million voices. We're just going to run the exact same play. And we gathered a campaign. The campaign raised about $1 million. It did over our internal expectations. We were very happy with its performance. I built 3 different kits for the office. I had all the cards nicely cut. I organized them. I thought, we're going to run Root again. We're going to use 3 groups. Essentially, Root was built with 2 external groups and 1 internal group. And there were basically 12 people who were the primary developers of Root. That's what we were going to do with Oath. And then something happened that messed it all up. We had been following in the late of 2019 reports of a pandemic just because we were worried it was going to affect factory production. It didn't really occur to us that it would do anything beyond that. And so when January rolled around, we didn't have any hesitation to starting a crowdfunding campaign. And the campaign ended, I think, in early February. And then when we got to late March, it was clear that we were going to need to shut things down. And those 3 beautiful kits that I built, they never got played. They're still sitting in a closet somewhere. We had made a little Discord for some reason. I have no idea why the first Oath Discord was made. There were maybe 10 people in it. And folks, we knew that we needed a place to play the game. So I remember starting to send invitations out and putting a little post on the Discord that just said, hey, some more people are going to be coming. I don't know how many. And suddenly there were 200, 300 people in this Discord. And the character of our work changed so dramatically. We had to rethink how we were making games, how we were thinking about feedback, and interestingly, all the things that I had not done in Root, that I had kind of forgotten about in Root, but which were present in the early phases of my design career, they came roaring back with relevance. So what did we learn about remote testing? First of all, you have almost perfect version control. When you engage a community, it is so important to keep them all on the same page. Everyone needs to be playing the same game. This can seem obvious, but when you're sending out kits, things get out of sync very quickly. If you are operating using a platform like Tabletop Simulator or Tabletop Playground or anyway, there's lots of them. You have full version control, but it's work that you have to do. So more of the work is moving to the side of the publisher and the creative team, but that is also taking work off the table of the actual testers. One small way of understanding this is that I used to release kits on Mondays or Tuesdays because it would give potential playtesters an entire week to get to Kinko's, to hijack the office printer, to build it in the evenings, so that by the time Friday came around, they could get people over, they could teach the game, and they could play it. When we moved to remote testing, we found that we actually pushed our launches to Fridays because people are going to read patch notes, they're going to get excited, they're going to want to play that moment. That meant our weeks were very busy because we were the ones having to assemble the digital kit every single week and to adjust our workflow so that it was easy to keep those kits current. The second thing that happened with the move to remote testing is that we gained massive testing bandwidth. So a lot of people want to play your games, but they might have a group that doesn't want to play your games. And so the pandemic essentially made all those players free radicals. They couldn't meet with their regular game. So of course they're going to drift to their interest areas. Are they really into train games? There's a Discord for that. There's a lot of Discords for that. So we were now testing 5, 6, 7 times as many games of Oath as were ever played of Root. I think by the end, we had something like 350 Oath games logged, and Root, we must have been like the low 40s, just in terms of external testing. The internal numbers are funny, but we can talk about it later. Then finally, and this is probably the most important one, the Discord served as a platform for a robust discourse about the game. Playtesters, for the first time, were reading each other's play reports. Because instead of submitting the reports using a Google Doc or sending me an email, God forbid, with a big long playtest report, they were posting them in a channel, a hashtag Game Reports channel. That meant that playtester A could read what had happened to playtester B and could comment on it. This created a whole community that I was no longer gatekeeping. I had essentially recreated those early chaotic Google Docs where game reports were being copied and pasted between one discussion thread about one rule into another. Sometimes the same game report would get like copy pasted Sherpa'd throughout the rules document as comments were closed. But it wasn't all good. There was complexity creep. Our community is incredible, but they love a complicated game. And the more articulated the game is, the more subtle, the more texture, that's good. They're optimized for it. And I didn't I was so busy managing the release of these new kits, doing essentially the work that we would today call community management, that I wasn't really acting as a stopgap. I had stopped being a good lead. I wasn't saying no. I was saying, oh, if it's more interesting, let's just go ahead and put that in. So here's the darkest secret, which is one of the victory conditions of Oath. In the earliest kits, which is what it was like for about 6 months, it was very simple. One power, it's a bid, you put objects on it, and then over the course of development, the words crept in. That bottom one is the release darkest secret. I'm happy to report that with the new Foundations expansion, we're much closer to the first thing. And we were able to clean up some of that stuff. We also had an issue with platform. So I never really thought about how platform could impact game development. Of course, it's obvious, right? Median's the message. Like, Tabletop Simulator has problems. Look at those dice faces. This is not right in the head. If you see a platform that's advertising those kinds of dice faces, you know something is a little off. And I'll give you a couple quick examples of how TTS really transformed things for us. Oath was designed, we knew that there were going to be a lot of Oath cards very early on in the design of the game. These Oath cards were templated so they would only have 2 or 3 lines of text. So the way this is possible, this card, for instance, this text doesn't mean anything in isolation, but because it's a campaign global modifier, it essentially adds like 2 lines of virtual text to the card that you can easily see that it applies to that. Likewise, this card can only be played at a site. That could have been a line of text on the card, easy enough to make an icon. So we had hard-coded this into the design of the game. And in fact, for the first few months of the game's development in physical space, we kept to it, and the complexity of the card stayed very low. But in TTS, you can zoom in. You can hold down Alt, and you can see all the words on that card. We even created a system where if you just moused over the card, you could get a live FAQ that would pull from our FAQ database, which we thought, this is lovely. The testers are going to love this because we can make sure that everyone is playing by the exact same system and it has full understanding of the rules. But if my editor says, can we add another line of text to that card? I'm not going to say no. We wanted people to be playing the game a lot, and so we built some automated tools within TTS. These were commissioned. So for instance, the Chronicle step, a lot of the setup and teardown were fully automated. So in TTS, you just press a button and it runs it, which is great. It made it so it was so easy to play games, but it also created a bunch of testing friction. Because I don't want to have to call up the guy in Florida who built this and say, hey, I need you to fix these things. Because it takes a long time. He needs to test it internally, see if there are bugs. That's slowing things down. So generally, when it came to the Oath's Chronicle and setup, we barely touched them in development. We weren't even really thinking about them. And the first time after the game was published, I played it physically. I thought, oh my gosh, this could be like half as complicated. The tools of automation that were out there to make the game accessible were kind of like directly working against us. They were actually like a community-driven tool was becoming, the game was starting to situate too much in its community. So one way to think about your community of players is that it's really easy for it to accidentally become not a community, but like a commune. You can get to this point where you've got this lovely community, but it's not really a community. It's like the 12 people in your house who love the game. And that can cause you to get a lot of false positives. Thankfully, the good far outweighed the bad. When Oath was released, it got all sorts of accolades. It found its audience. People really loved what we were doing with the game. And all of these reviews, which were very glowing, had places where they noticed things that we could have obviously fixed, but we were blind to because of the method that we'd used to build them. Now, after Oath was done, we conducted an extended internal debrief on the project to talk about what we had done right and what we had done wrong. Because Oath had revealed the degree to which we had gotten very lucky with Root, and there were things that we applied from Root that worked really well, and there were other things that Oath revealed about our processes. Because we wanted to do something even bigger, but if we were going to do something bigger, we were going to have to be sensitive to our failures. And that, of course, brings us to ARCs. So at the start, here's what we knew about ARCs. ARCs, we wanted to do a science fiction game. I've been wanting to do a science fiction game for a long time. I had wanted it to dramatically reconfigure some of the genre conventions that we associate with science fiction games. And I also wanted to build a game that could have the scope and breadth of Oath, but be fundamentally more modular and even more playable in certain respects. It was also just going to be a much bigger project. Oath Oath, in some ways, Oath was 4 times as large as Root. We knew Arcs was going to be at least that large again. Now, that isn't measured by card count. It was just the demands of the actual game. So Arcs was designed as really more of a framework than a game. We had to build an engine that was very moddable, very easy to use. That takes a lot more work. So we put a few changes into our process. First, we had a lot of analog design periods. I worked on Arcs for 1.5 years before I built a single digital tabletop for it. Drew, sitting here in the front row, did not play Arcs for a long time because it was only played by people in person. I needed to feel what it felt like to put those cards on the table, to clean up the court deck at the end of every chapter. I needed to know how the victory points would feel, how the game would pack up and set up. And I purposely kept all of the prototypes very stripped down. This helped so much because it also meant that in the early stages of design, when the game was in its most plastic format, I also didn't have to worry about answering Discord messages. I didn't have to worry about our social media presence. I was just worried about the design of the game. Now, at the same time, we had all these Oath testers who would send me messages on Discord and ask me when Arcs testing was going to start. We had activated a community that had been part of the development of a game. And while some of them were happy to work on John Company, not all of them, most of them were like, no, give me the space one. So we had to find a way to engage them. So one of the things that had worked really well with both Root and Oath was to be very transparent about our design process. And so I started another long series of design diaries. I posted lots of videos of books we were reading and things we were thinking about because I wanted people to understand what we were building, even if it wasn't yet ready to show them. And this worked tremendously well. So the Arcs crowdfunding campaign outraised Oath by almost 50%. It activated a huge audience. We were very happy with it. And the game that launched, the game that doesn't really look like Arcs, but we promise it's kind of Arcs over there on the left, you could play this day one of the campaign. We had a great laid out rule book. It was super accessible. And we had done our best to make it so anybody who was interested in this game, who wanted to explore it, could access it right away. We wanted to lead with that kind of transparency. Now, there were some problems. The game wasn't done. In fact, it looked far more done than it was. And the fact that we had hidden some of our design process meant that when people did jump in on that day one and play the demo, they left thinking like, I don't know. They say the game's almost done, but it seems a little slow, a little weird. And we had some negative-ish press. Dan's negative press is still so beautifully written that it sounds positive. But I like this Dicebreaker piece by Alex because the Dicebreaker team played the launch version of Arcs and was very disappointed, which is fine. People are going to be disappointed when they play games. It's not, no one who works in the creative industry should be sad when they get a negative review. It's good, it's constructive. But Alex in particular, they were in like the core audience. They loved Oath. It was like one of their favorite releases that year. And yet Arcs wasn't hitting for them. But because we had written all those designer diaries, because we had done all those interviews, even in these trepidatious early responses, people were taking our framing. They weren't saying the game is broken. They were saying the game was failing to live up to its expectations, which means at some level, we were not looking at a disappointed market. We were looking at a community that was kind of watching with apprehension. And if you're designing games in a community format, that's what you want. You want, I mean, this isn't, there's nothing sneaky about this. Like, we are building games together. The community needs us to help make these games. We're all working on these things. And if the game is failing to live up for its ambitions, it's not a bad purchase. It's something in construction. It's something that could become better. So when we got into the development of Arcs, we built a lot of firebreaks in. Whenever we ran into trouble, we would pause development. The best example of this was after the campaign had launched. I took a version of the game. I worked on it all summer, and there were some key problems that I was running into. And Josh and I were in the Discord talking to people, and we just couldn't solve the puzzle that we were running into. And we were running hot. We were working late into the weekend. And at some point I just said, like, we have to stop, actually. We know it's wrong. We can't fix this specific kind of problem working in a forum. We just have to take it internal. And I fully shut down Arcs development for about 2.5 months. No one even within the studio played it. I just worked the problem by myself. And then as I came to solutions, this was around how the victory conditions were constructed, I started bringing in Josh, bringing in other staff at Leader, bringing in external testers that I trusted, and slowly widen things off. And so by the time we got to September and October, we were able to resume development with structural fixes that would bear out in the long term. When it came to interacting with that audience too, we once again approached the we once again took the approach of patch notes, where sort of on Fridays we would have updates, and the updates would usually have images on them. They would have casual language kind of talking about. They were designed the way the Dwarf Fortress patch notes work. We wanted to highlight funny exploits, things that we had noticed. We wanted to show the audience that we were listening to them. If you're a tester and you flag something as wrong, that can be an embarrassing thing as a tester. You don't want to, you like these people, you don't want to make their lives miserable, and yet you're asking them on Saturday night to make a ruling about an obscure reference. So you want to encourage that behavior within bounds. People should be polite, obviously. But these updates were places where we could even, there were even instances where I would call out specific testers and say, like, so-and-so had a great idea about how the magnate plotline works in Act 2. Let's highlight that good idea. We have a redo of the magnate that fixes this problem. So I don't know if I have, and then actually I'll just mention, this is just an interesting application of community development where we would start doing scenarios. ARCS doesn't have scenarios, but what we would do is say, hey, we need testers to play these scenarios. We would give them cute little names, and then we'd say, we need you to play these plot lines in these contexts. And then they could put their playtest reports under those headers. And as the community managers, it let us better understand all this data that we were getting. The result of this was that we got something that was easily 2 to 3 times as polished as Oath. We had many more testers. We had a really robust internal digital playtesting system. So we would use 2 different TTS mods, a red mod and a blue mod. And the way it worked is we only updated the mods every other week, so that if you were playing an ARCS campaign, which might be 3 games long, or it was usually 3 games long, you would have 2 weeks to finish your campaign, and then the next version push would be pushed to the blue version. And then we did this for most of testing, and in the last 3 or 4 months, we joined all the copies to the red version, which is actually still the TTS mod that we use today. And when testing was over, so this is 11/22/2023, this is basically like the second to last testing update. The game entered press around Christmas of that year. People kept playing. It's the best indication that your community is deeply engaged with the work that you're doing. If you stop testing, you tell everyone the game's over, and they keep playing. It's a good sign. And it was a good sign that was borne out when the game was released, because we saw a stronger response from game critics than we'd ever seen before, and more unanimity, and it was because they didn't have the weird caveats. There wasn't a, boy, this game's really great, but there's this system that doesn't feel finished. This was a fully realized game, and it only became fully realized because we were able to build it with a group of people. So we still made some mistakes, though. There are still things that we learned. The biggest one was being keenly aware of when you were in design versus development. Communities are exceptionally good at development. They are bad at design. And it's because when you're doing design work, you're determining the parameters of the problem. How big is the foundation of the building you're building? Well, that's an interesting question. But if you are a construction worker, you need somebody else to just make a call, right? And so design decisions are best made by small groups, especially groups who are close to schedule and who are able to make the big calls about what needs to be cut. You have to watch out for complexity drift. And actually, this is a place where ARCS had its little problems. There were places where there were just maybe a little too many cards in play. And that's stuff that was coming because of how we did a lot of our testing. We controlled for it a little bit better. We also have to be aware that people have higher complexity tolerances. The longer a playtester is involved in development, the more immune they are going to be to thinking about these big kinds of questions. And finally, don't be afraid to step away, to just turn it off for a little bit. I have found in my experience that no one cares if a game is delayed for good reasons. They care if a game gets delayed for bad reasons. if someone is ever dishonest, if a rule book isn't released because it doesn't exist, if someone feels like, wait, there's all this art done, what do you mean the game's going to be there in 2 months, and then in 2 months it's not there? That fractures trust. But when you come to a community and say, you know what, we found a broken plot line. It's complicated. We're going to try to fix it. We need an extra few months. You're going to get nothing but understanding from those people. Nobody is having a game shortage. If you tell someone, look, the game will be a little bit later, they think, well, fine, I've got more time to play the game that just came in the mail. One of the biggest things we did wrong, though, is that we found that it was very easy to fall into these communities a little bit too deeply. It's sort of intoxicating. You're always in a conversation about something you care about. So it has high personal costs. I decided not to share it because Josh isn't here, but when he gave a talk to GDC, he did a readout of his Apple Watch, and you could see the weekends after version pushes where his heart rate and his sleep was going down, and it was because he was staying up. And a lot of these testers, they're engaging with the game on the weekend, which means you're engaging with them, and you're trying to give good support and answer right away, and then you're coming into Monday ragged. So this happened this weekend, and I wrote Josh a long memo about an oath thing, but then I went to schedule message, and I said Monday at 9, because he doesn't need to worry about it right now. It also only works with certain player communities. Everything I've talked about, I think, is especially true for player communities really interested in medium to heavyweight games. They really care about these games. This is a place where the market is sometimes not well serving its audience. So don't think that this kind of community-driven methodology is going to work evenly everywhere. Okay, I want to say a few things about Oath New Foundations because it was a place where, the color looks so whack on that. All right. Oath New Foundations was a place where we looked at what we had done with ARCs. We had a lot of ARCs. ARCs is a rare project where we didn't have one debrief meeting about ARCs. We had like 10 because it had been like a 3-year project for the studio. And as we went into New Foundations, I looked for places where we could apply some of those lessons, but also we could try to break some new ground. And the biggest place where we broke new ground is that we actually, if we think about design as having kind of 3 core areas, there's like early concept vision, then there's design, and then there's development. Usually, when I'm talking about community development, I mean, there's a reason why the talk's called community-driven development. I think the community does a lot of good work in that last phase. With Oath, we wondered, what if we involve the community at the beginning? What if we figure out what they want before we even start doing the design work? Now, this is dangerous because if you ask a crowd what they want, you're going to get a crowd's worth of answers. But if we listen to how they're engaging with the game, if we're sensitive to it, we might be surprised. We might learn something we didn't know. Now, Oath was not a game that we had ever planned on designing. Never planned on expanding. Oath was never a game that we planned on expanding. In fact, it was sort of built against expansions initially. But I kept running into people who wanted to see it grow. And you would see things like this, like an Oath cookbook, or this like amazing multi-game tournament suit wars like system where everybody is like secretly bidding on what suits are going to be dominant in the deck, and then you're playing games to determine like the makeup of the world deck, and then after 10 games, it's like you're playing a train game with the world deck. It's interesting. When I was at Essen and somebody came up to me, let's see if I can get this video to play. It was one of the most amazing con experiences that I ever had. They had like this totally full Chronicle book, and it was just unbelievable. It was so clear that it had been like loved and used, and then they had this poem that somebody had written. And I thought, okay, so people are engaging with Oath differently than I had planned on engaging it, because I have no poems in my Chronicle book. So what happens when we take that energy and we design an expansion that works for that audience? So I treated design, this is a screen cap of the very first Oath design journal. This isn't anything I've published. I have a giant Oath design journal. It's like a couple hundred pages that was kept throughout the entire process. And the very first entry, I decided to reframe it where it's not like I have some clever idea and I want to run out into the market and tell people about my clever idea. I thought, what do people want out of Oath? What if I think about design fundamentally as an obligation that is owed between the folks who are in charge of the game, who like own it in the commercial sense, and the audience who wants to engage with it? What if we think about ourselves as less like creators and more like custodians, and we are all building this community together? Now, how do you sell this? I don't really even know what it's going to look like. I have some ideas. And even here I was like, here's what we got in the cooker, a bunch of modules. Is it one thing? Is it a bunch of things? I don't know. Some of these things are in the game, some aren't. When I pitched this to Patrick and the folks at Leader Games, I said, a couple rules if we do this project. One, I don't know how long it's going to take, and it might have crazy overruns. I said, two, I think we have to be totally transparent that we are not sure what we're doing, and that we are opening ourselves up to the possibility that this might go sideways. And so when we built the crowdfunding campaign, we actually really leaned into it. So we had a header video that instead of like being flashy and having animation and a text, it was essentially like a little mini doc where you see me in different ways saying over and over again, I don't know what we're doing. Do you want us to do this? Give us some money. We'll work on it for a long time. And when we actually got to the development of the game, it was quite chaotic. The project raised more money than we thought it was going to raise, which was great. But then that converted into time where the way I framed it to the team was, if the project funds well, I want an extra 6 months to experiment with things that we'll probably throw away. And we spent 6 months experimenting, and we threw away about 6 months worth of work. Because it turns out it wasn't right. And it made the whole game stronger in ways that were orthogonal to even our desires at that moment. Development was difficult, because if we are coming into a project without a clear initial vision, and instead just an aspiration, people are going to fill in that vacuum. We had a lot of testers say like, oh, well, it seems like you want to do X. And community members who would be really adamant that like a specific thing that I like half mentioned in an interview should be the central element of the expansion. But the longer we worked on it, the more we found ourselves asserting a voice of what Oath New Foundations should look like. That meant that we had to have slightly spikier patch notes. We had to spend a lot more time like whapping people on the wrist if we felt like they were taking the game in a direction that we didn't think it should go in. And it took a long time for us to just figure out what the proper voice was for the game. But we ended up with something really beautiful, and I can't tell you how it's going to be reviewed yet because I don't know. Oath is coming out to an audience with a lot of people who really love what we've done with the expansion, who think it's remarkable, but there are a lot of people who are suspicious. That's good. That means that the community of players will decide if they want it. I don't want to know the answer until they've had a chance to play the game. So in sum, no game is an island. Our games exist in these huge, vast networks of context, and that context also informs the games that we make. If I could boil everything down to just one little image, it's this. Your game is participating in a conversation about what games can do, which is also the thing that's making your game. It's not just a product. It is not just a flight of fancy. It is an argument, a text, a statement about the limits of the kinds of stories games can tell. And that same conversation is going to inform the next game you do. So instead of a cloistered puppet theater for some Austrian princes, I give you Bruegel's children's games, one of the most remarkable paintings ever done, where everyone is at play, where the games bleed into each other, where what a game can do happens in the aggregate, and you have to understand that like you don't get to paint the painting, you're like there. You're one little corner of it. And you let the players decide which games they're going to play and participate in the making of their own games. All right, thank you very much, and I'll take any questions you might have.